Welcome to the Superintendent's Webcast on June 9th, 2020. We have a packed agenda for you today, as always. And of course, make sure you submit your questions on the Go Soapbox. We also have some questions that originated from some other meetings previously this week that we did not have answers for at the time. We'll be addressing those during the question and answer time. We also have our partners with the Department of Public Health with us again, and you're going to be seeing them frequently, of course. I also wanted to update you. We had our first meeting of the Superintendent's Advisory Council since the COVID-19 pandemic started. As you know, we met with them around March 9th, and then they were not scheduled due to their normal schedule and due to the fact we were anticipating a new commissioner to meet again until September. However, after hearing feedback from superintendents, we are now going to meet with the Superintendent's Advisory Council every other Monday to discuss COVID-19 related issues to reopening school as well. And then, of course, the opposite Mondays, we're meeting with the Education Continuation Task Force, and we have an announcement about that and some minor changes that will make that a better process. But we'll have the Lieutenant Governor here, I think, is going to be joining us at some point during the webcast to join me in announcing that and how we're going to move forward. I don't think she's on yet. When she does, we will discuss that. So we have a packed agenda as always. We also have a hard stop at 4 because the governor's press conference is now at 4, and I know that always has information related to our work in K-12, but also just our health and safety for all Kentuckians. So we try to watch that when we can. But Tony, I'll turn it over to you for a quick update on the commissioner search.
Okay, let me know when you guys can see the screen, please.
We can see it.
Okay. All right, so just a quick update on the 2020 commissioner search. Just here's a brief update with your timeline and your dateline. Obviously, you can see there we've had a very long short is what I like to call it, 6 months. From December 12th, when the announcement was made to search for a new commissioner. We collected feedback from the public on what we'd like to see in a new commissioner and selected a search firm, and then also collected selected applications from potential candidates. That was through May 31st, which led us to last week and the announcement that the Board of Education has narrowed the search down to 11 candidates. We just released the meeting agenda yesterday publicly for this week's meeting, which will occur Thursday and Friday, the virtual interview of candidates, and expect to have a second round of interviews that first week of July. And there is a potential, as you can see, and I will use the word potential, that we could have an announcement of who our next education commissioner is as early as mid-July or end of July, early August of 2020. So there is a quick snapshot of where we are with our commissioner search. Things are moving along, and Interim Commissioner Brown, if you wanted to add anything to this slide, other than that, I'm ready to move forward.
Only thing I will add is that I have enjoyed this challenge, but I welcome the new commissioner to join and look forward to meeting him or her.
Okay. All right. Next up is going to be Marty Park. Dr. Park, are you available?
Absolutely. Thank you, Tony.
All right. And did you want to run your slides?
Yes, that's fine.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you so much, and thank you for the opportunity to be with you today. This is an opportunity for us to come together with additional guidance. I first want to thank you as district and school leaders and superintendents for your leadership as our team works throughout the state and at the regional level and at the district level. Your leadership is extremely evident, and it's awesome. And so Leading through uncertainty and ambiguity, as Kevin has said many times, all the unknowns is absolutely one of the hardest things to do. And I believe that as we look back on this time and we'll know that we've done our very best work for our kids. And so as we go through this, I'll share quickly where to get to the guidance, and then we'll just hit a few slides and give a quick overview. But I want to first hit on a couple really key points. No one should have the delusion that this is somehow an ideal situation. We know that. We've discussed that, and we're working through that. Or more specifically, that technology is a replacement for a physical environment. We've always said that if we had to pick between an amazing teacher or technology, that the amazing teacher wins every time. And so we always push really hard on, we never do technology for technology's sake. However, our current scenario certainly dictates that we can find new and improved ways or upgrades to support our amazing teachers with education technology that works and it helps us develop, capture, and even accelerate learning during this time. We know that as we closed out last school year, a lot of work was geared towards review work, and we know that the structures of our non-traditional instructional time programming, which has been awesome, wasn't really designed for this time and in the scenarios that we find ourselves in. And so as we ramp up the school year and we find ourselves introducing new content and with new students, then we find ourselves needing to redesign, and that's the challenge ahead of us. We need to get our kids back to school as quickly as possible. We need to get back to learning, back to resources, and back to our teachers as soon as we can, in the very best way that we can. And so we have distributed learning opportunities that provide more flexibility. We'll talk through those. We have to trust our teachers in new and improved and upgraded ways, and trust our processes even more than we ever have before, potentially. And so we're going to have to expect what we refer to as different rates of acceleration and different rates of adoption. We know that we have some flexible variables that we're going to have to throw on the table. But nonetheless, from the Kentucky Department of Education and from our office, and I think maybe someone needs to mute, but from our Office of Education Technology, we know that we have some North Stars and we have some groundswells that as we dig into, we're going to be able to accelerate and highlight while also getting messy. And so it's about this conversation and additional guidance today is about customizing for you and your students and your teachers. And so I'm going to share my screen and just quickly walk through. And Tony, if you don't mind, no, can you see my screen okay?
Yes, I think so. Yep.
Okay, thank you. So from the Kentucky Department of Education website, obviously we're all used to going to KDE's COVID-19 webpage. And as Tony and the commissioner and others have highlighted, and Dr. Foster, our reopening guidance, I wanted to point out that the additional guidance for this week is focused and targeted on alternative learning design strategies. And so if you tap that, download that document, we will get into some additional ideas on models and strategies for you to customize. There's certainly not one way to implement, not one strategy that makes the most sense for every district and every school across the state. And so it's absolutely all about customizing. And I love how Kevin puts this. This is about a playbook in your back pocket. This is all about calling a play and having additional resources that you can pull your team back together and find a new play that may work even better. And so with that, I wanted to get into 4 specific strategies, and these strategies have been shared in a lot of different ways. We also know that just in an average day's Twitter feed, we'll find articles on real research about what other countries are doing, and we've leveraged that as much as we can. We've leveraged scenarios that other states are discussing, and so we're pulling that back together as strong discussion points for strategies that can work for us. So strategy number one, we've keyed on as a scheduled rotation strategy. Many of you have already discussed this. This is identifying potentially a week where a group of students, and in this visual we've identified as Group A, are live at school. That gives us an opportunity to focus face to face. That also gives us an opportunity to recognize social distancing as much as possible. Obviously, we want to, and we know we all want to keep the health and safety of our kids and our families, and the health and safety of our teachers first and foremost. And so this strategy helps work towards that as much as possible. While maybe potentially week 2 in a scheduled rotation model, we bring a different group of students live to school. There are a lot of challenges with this strategy, obviously, but if we look at the strategy as a whole, you can also realize a day where identified throughout the week that potentially is all online, and that could be live or on demand. And so these structures can help us look at launching and introducing new content and curriculum in this first strategy. And the flexible variables that I mentioned earlier, these are variables that we should all throw on the table. And I think a key point to point out is having the freedom to design is extremely important during this time. And I know that the questions we've all been asking and working through are hurdles and barriers that we need removed in some cases. And so, for example, what does attendance and participation look like in some of these strategies? And I think the great thing, and Kevin has spoken to this before, as early as last week, that there's ongoing work, and that's additional guidance that we'll release soon about attendance and participation and how different strategies, design strategies can be successful, so that we don't have logistics that play against us, whether that's from a funding model perspective or any other. And so, again, in this strategy, we're looking at fewer students physically in the building, and we're looking at learning design for students will likely incorporate different demonstrations of learning, as well as heavily leveraging digital methods of collecting evidence of learning. It's important to note that, and we refer to as intentional planned digital interactions for our students who are not physically at school. And so that we'll carry that theme forward as planned digital interactions. Again, from a flexible variable perspective, start times may look different. Certainly not trying to stick to maybe a bell schedule that has worked in previous years. And this is a completely different design, and being able to throw those variables on the table become really important. So strategy number 2, and we're using the word quite a bit of a hybrid model. Strategy number 2 starts to leverage live interactions and starts to leverage the ability to design around co-teaching. And so a synchronous opt-in hybrid model would have us identify students that we have live at school all the time. These are students who have additional resource needs. These are students maybe who lack home internet access, or these are students who need customized or specialized equipment to work through their pathway and course options. There's a lot of different reasons why we would identify groups of students, but again, we look by implementing a design strategy such as this hybrid model. We can get down to a number of students physically in our classrooms and in our schools that we can leverage the social distancing that we need. As I mentioned, there are co-teaching opportunities. This is a model or a strategy where, for example, if you're familiar with the flipped strategy of blended learning, where we might introduce a concept, and our learners would watch that video and then come to a planned interaction point throughout a day where we have a live session between our facilitators, our coaches, and our teachers to leverage our students at home, while also working and coaching through our students who are live in the classroom with us. Now, this strategy is really important for us to think about how many classes we have in our schools, maybe all 5th grade classes, and try to bundle teachers together to co-teach and help each other. Also, again, referencing the health and safety of our teachers. Maybe we have teachers who are high health risk or have other reasons that they cannot physically be in the building. Maybe they are our online facilitators and our online coaches in this strategy. And so it's important to think through those flexible variables. But you will have access to this PowerPoint, but all of the information here is also referenced in that additional guidance. Again, key that students have internet access at home in this model, specifically that we identify the students who have internet access at home and those who do not, and understand that the students who do not are great candidates for students that we need to identify and get to live at school, live face-to-face with our teachers. Again, plan digital interactions. We would never see a scenario, and we always want to point out here that we don't see a scenario where or best practice where there's a camera always on and our students at home or off campus are sitting in front of a screen all day long. That's not a scenario that's good learning design, and so it's important for us to make sure that as we design, we keep those pieces in mind. Strategy number 3 is what we refer to as a combination strategy, and again, this is all about alternative learning design. And so strategy number 3 leverages different groupings of kids and then rotates or has that scheduled rotation and bringing, for example, in week 1, we have group A live at school while group B is connected at home. And then week 2 would flip that experience to where group B comes live at school. So that would obviously give us opportunity over the weekend or on a Friday to do extreme cleaning. This combination strategy leverages components of the previous 2, but students would be sorted and worked into 2 different groups in this occasion. And additionally, it's worth pointing out that on-demand learning or asynchronous learning designs are also targeted in this strategy. Again, with these strategies, it's all about customization and having plays in your playbook. And then finally, the 4th strategy that we point out is an all virtual and expanded learning opportunity for students. Right now, today, about 100 school districts, over 100 right now, at the launch of this school year, will be offering courses online to students, all online. This is an experience where we're not specifically tagged to a physical teacher in a building, but we create an opportunity for our students to take courses all online and virtual. And so this strategy leverages that experience.
Hey, Marty.
Absolutely.
We're having some reports that it's hard to hear you.
Okay.
So I don't know.
I can hear him fine.
Okay.
Yeah, just getting a couple of comments that it sounds muffled a little bit.
Yep.
So I don't.
Hey, Marty, you might turn off your video. I think that'll increase your audio bandwidth.
Okay. No problem at all. I can absolutely do that.
Okay.
Yep. Okay. And so this final model and strategy that we point out leverages additional opportunities for our students to have full course settings online and virtual. Now, this strategy is a bit different than how we engaged in our non-traditional instructional time work to close out the school year. This is setting up opportunities for students to fully enroll. Right now, we have 21 school districts who offer online and virtual courses, planned online and virtual, to students from neighboring districts. And this is the design that we need to expand and we want to expand. And so we have some additional funding that we want to think about and look at. We're writing for an additional federal grant to look at expanding this opportunity. But what we do know is that all of our districts have the opportunity to set up this structure in-house. Again, over 100 of our school districts today, you are offering students online and virtual courses Maybe that's through a partner, maybe that's locally through course design. And so we believe this strategy is going to be extremely helpful in this current environment. So, Tony, I want to pass it back to you, and I'll stop sharing my screen. Again, if you get an opportunity to go download the guidance document, and we will and we will be able to answer additional questions as we move forward.
Okay. All right, that sounds fine. Kevin, do you know if the Lieutenant Governor has joined us yet, or do you want us to continue on?
You can continue on until I hear from her. She's was in another meeting when she's going to join us, I think, if she's able. If not, I'll make the announcement at the end of the meeting.
Gotcha. Okay, we will go on to, let me get my screen up. All right, the next up is Todd Allen. He's our interim general counsel, and he's going to talk about district liability considerations during COVID-19. Todd?
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with each of you this afternoon. We created this presentation based on some concerns that we had heard from superintendents and school districts around various liability scenarios and situations that may impact operation of school for the upcoming school year. So hopeful that this presentation will help to explain some of the liability protections that are already in place for school districts that may impact your operations for reopening schools. I have asked to join me today Wayne Young, who really needs no introduction, with the Kentucky Association of School Administrators, KASA, and Wayne agreed to join so that he can jump in throughout my presentation and offer any advice or information that he may have that may be beneficial to you all. And we also have David Livingston on the call. Mr. Livingston offered to join the call today whenever I spoke with him about some district general liability questions and concerns regarding your all's general liability insurance policies. Mr. Livingston is an agent with Roding Insurance in Lexington, and we appreciate him joining the call. Of course, I have to give the caveat that we're not endorsing any certain company or agency, but certainly appreciate Mr. Livingston agreeing to join us. We'll get to district liability insurance questions a little bit later on in the presentation, and obviously feel free to send your questions into the Go Soapbox. So Tony, next slide there. If you've ever emailed me or any other attorney in the Office of Legal Services at the department, you have probably seen this kind of response that we include in all of our information that we send out. As attorneys, we can only provide legal advice to our clients, and my client is the Department of Education and the State Board of Education. So I cannot provide legal advice to any school districts or superintendents. However, state law does allow me to provide you all with information regarding the education laws. The presentation that I'm about to give is not legal advice, and if you are searching for legal advice, you should contact your local school board counsel. Next slide. So the reason that we developed this presentation, I think there was some concern specifically around a situation where a student or even an adult may return to school for the next school year and at some point contract COVID-19 and then later try to make some type of legal claim against the school district for negligence in them contracting COVID-19. I think there's been some concerns around a student or a staff member getting sick and suing the school district. So I have just a few slides here regarding negligence claims and the general immunity that is granted to school districts for negligence claims. Negligence is the failure to use reasonable care, and focus on that word reasonable. We've talked about that before in a few other presentations, which results in damage or injury to another person. So for example, a personal injury that may result if someone broke their leg or their arm in a motor vehicle accident. Our presentation today is not going to address liability for any contract claims. So any contracts that the district may have entered into that it can't fulfill or its vendor can't fulfill as a result of COVID-19. And the presentation won't address any claims that a school district failed to implement specific statutes requiring educational services. So for example, a claim under the IDEA that an IEP was not implemented. Next slide. The case that really deals with a lot of governmental immunity that applies to school districts is a case called Enero V Davis. It was decided by the Kentucky Supreme Court in 2001. This was a situation where a student was injured during batting practice when he was struck in the head with a baseball and the student was not wearing a batting helmet. He filed a lawsuit against the school district, against the athletic director, and against the coach, alleging that they negligently failed to require batting helmets to be worn during batting practice. This case provided the Supreme Court an opportunity to really clarify immunity for school districts throughout the state of Kentucky. And immunity in general is just what it suggests. It is immunity from suit. It prevents the school district from being sued or certain officials within the school district from being sued altogether. And the reasoning behind this, as indicated by the court, is that governmental entities such as school districts should not be afraid to put policies and procedures in place, so long as they're put in place with good faith, and to implement those policies and procedures. Doing so should not cause them fear of a lawsuit. So the court held that courts should not be called upon to pass judgment on policy decisions made by members of coordinate branches of government in the context of tort actions, because such actions furnish an inadequate crucible for testing the merits of social, political, or economic policy. And put another way, it's not a tort for government to govern. Now, practically speaking, immunity does not prevent a litigant from actually filing the lawsuit. They can still go to the clerk's office and pay the filing fee and file a lawsuit against a school district or a school official. However, immunity is grounds for very quick dismissal of the lawsuit. If the court grants the immunity, then we don't even get into discovery and the lengthy process that may become involved in a lawsuit, because the school district is just immune from being sued. Immunity hinges on governmental versus proprietary functions. In order to be granted immunity, a local board of education has to be engaged in a governmental function and not a proprietary function. The court has previously held that a local board of education is an agency of state government, and they're entitled to immunity when they're performing those governmental functions. And those are ones that are not for a commercial purpose. So I will say that courts, in interpreting the immunity of school boards, have very, very frequently held that the operations of a school district, so long as they're tied to providing educational services to students, those are governmental functions. Proprietary functions are those that we see various government entities getting into that a private sector business would typically be engaged in. An example there that's listed in the slide is the Kentucky Center for the Arts Corporation. The court system had an opportunity to address that historically and said, while that is a quasi-governmental entity, they're really performing a private function, not a governmental function. However, like I said, the local boards of education are overwhelmingly found by the courts in most of their operations to be performing governmental functions. And operating schools, which is what we're talking about for the upcoming school year, would certainly fall within that function. The local board of education also will not be held vicariously liable for the alleged negligence of its employees. So therefore, if a parent or an individual were to file a lawsuit against a teacher or an administrator, the local board is not going to be held liable for the actions of its staff in that situation. Next slide, please. So continuing on with the governmental immunity information, qualified official immunity is the immunity that applies to individuals. So here we're talking about school teachers, superintendents, administrators, other school staff within the school district. Previously, we were talking about the school district itself as an entity. When we apply the qualified immunity analysis, this applies to negligent performance, so the performance can even be negligent, by a public officer or employee, so long as they're performing discretionary acts or functions. Discretionary acts are those involving the exercise of discretion and judgment, personal deliberation, decision and judgment, in good faith and within the scope of the employee's authority. There is no immunity for the negligent performance of a ministerial act. So we have discretionary acts versus ministerial acts. Ministerial acts are those that simply require obedience to the orders of others. For example, complying with a policy that has been written by the local board. If the local policy provides that you act, you do A, B, and C, so that's what you have to do. You have to follow that policy, do A, B, and C. So there's no immunity if in doing that A, B, and C that's specifically set out in policy, if that's performed negligently, if you don't adhere to that policy. However, many of you on the call obviously are superintendents, and a big portion of your job are these discretionary acts and functions. Every day you're faced with decision points where you have to make a decision. You have to exercise discretion and judgment, you have to deliberate, and you have to make a decision in that situation. For example, what type of procedure to implement internally for various operations. That type of procedure or policy that you're going to put in place for internal operations, that's a discretionary act most of the time, and you would be entitled to qualified official immunity in that situation. So very simply put, thinking back to the thought behind immunity, for those situations where we have to think and apply discretion, exercise judgment, personal deliberation to come up with policies or internal procedures, how we're going to do something, or we're faced with a decision in the heat of the moment that we have to make. So long as it's in good faith and within the scope of the employee's authority, there's a good argument that qualified official immunity applies. However, if there's already a policy or procedure in place that applies to the situation, then of course school staff officials would follow that policy. Wayne, I'll pause there and see if you have anything to add overall to the immunity discussion under Enero.
Thanks, Todd. And no, really, I don't. I think you're doing a great job. This area of the law is tremendously complex. If people are having trouble following it, there's reason for that. It's not Todd's explanation. His explanation is great. It's that the courts, even when you read cases, they've kind of bounced around on this. There was a case out of Bullitt County just 3 or 4 years ago that went back into this immunity issue, and it sort of cut the baby in half and said, well, these people have immunity, but these people don't. And it was over the enforcement of a policy involving teachers being on duty before school and providing for student supervision. So it can really just make you pull your hair out, but just understand that my advice to administrators, superintendents, and teachers is when you're out there performing your duties in a reasonable, thoughtful way, and you're making decisions, generally you're going to have this immunity available to you.
Absolutely. Thank you. Next slide, please. We also wanted to touch on some federal protections that are in place that grant some level of immunity under the Coverdell Teacher Protection Act of 2001. Here, a teacher is defined in the law as instructors, principals, administrators, and individual school board members. And you'll notice that a lot of this language is very similar to the state law that we just discussed related to immunity. That is, there are certain good faith elements. We talk about very frequently acting reasonably under the circumstances, that individuals have to act in good faith. But under the Coverdell Protection Act, civil immunity is granted to a teacher if all of the following are satisfied. The teacher has to be acting within the scope of his or her employment. That was also required under the official immunity, the qualified official immunity that we discussed previously. The actions have to be carried out in conformity with federal, state, and local laws in furtherance of efforts to control, discipline, expel, or suspend a student, or, and notice this, maintain order or control in the classroom or a school. Maintaining order or control, certainly in light of COVID-19, would fall within that category, in my opinion. If appropriate, the teacher has to be properly licensed or certified for the activities that they were carrying out. The harm was not caused by willful or criminal misconduct, gross negligence, reckless misconduct, or conscious flagrant indifference to the rights or safety of individuals by the teacher. That's very similar to acting in good faith as required under the state law. And the harm has to not be caused by the teacher operating a motor vehicle. Next slide, please. Under the Coverdell Immunity Act, immunity does not apply if the conduct constitutes a crime of violence or terrorism for which the teacher is convicted, involves a sexual offense, involves misconduct for which the defendant is found to have violated federal or state civil rights laws, or where the teacher was under the influence of drugs or alcohol. So I bring up the Coverdell Immunity Act just as a note to you as a further layer of protection that also exists in the event that a lawsuit were filed against a school district or a school official related to COVID-19 for the upcoming school year. Next slide, please. Oh, there we go. So I wanted to add this slide in, the elements of a negligence claim, because I think this is really telling for the situation that we've been faced with and the questions that are being asked. So you recall we've talked about immunity, and immunity says you can't be sued, and if you are sued, it should be immediately dismissed. And we talked about the elements that we look at whenever we are looking to grant immunity to a school official or to a school district. But even if those immunity claims failed and a lawsuit were to go forward, these are still the elements of a negligence claim that a plaintiff would have to prove against a school district or a school official. They have to prove that there's a duty, there's been a breach of that duty, there's causation and damages. This kind of takes us back to basic negligence claims. I was kind of thinking back to my time in law school whenever I was putting this together, because these are the four elements of a negligence claim that are drilled into our head. And the reason that I have causation in bold is because I think that's the most problematic element that a plaintiff would have if they tried to file a lawsuit against a school district or an official as a result of a child or an adult contracting COVID-19. So school districts certainly have a duty of reasonable care to protect the school students, the children who are coming to them on a daily basis for educational services. Whether or not they breach that duty in certain circumstances would certainly be an argument, but more importantly, I think plaintiffs would have a real difficult time proving causation. And when we talk about causation, that is where a plaintiff has to prove that whatever action or inaction by the school district or official was actually the cause of the plaintiff's damages. So if you think back to that Enero case that we talked about, it's pretty easy for us to see, take a snapshot in time and see exactly when the student became injured. When that baseball was thrown and the baseball struck the student in the head who was not wearing a batting helmet, that's when the injury occurred. And it's relatively reasonable to link the student's injuries to that moment in time when the damage occurred. If you think about contracting COVID-19, however, it isn't nearly as clear the moment that a student would have contracted COVID-19. Whether that occurred in the school setting at all, or whether that occurred outside the school setting when the student maybe went to church or visited a family member, even if it occurred in the school setting, whether it was during lunch when all the students have to remove their masks in order to eat, even though that lunch may have been in the classroom, there are a lot of questions that I think would be asked that would make it fairly difficult for a plaintiff to prove this causation element in terms of a negligence claim. Again, I'll pause there. If Wayne has anything to add, I'm certainly open to other points of view and opinions on that topic, but I think that would be a major barrier, assuming that we even got to that point and a school district or official weren't dismissed on the immunity issue.
I think you're exactly right, Todd. I think you've honed in on the central element of this whole thing.
Next slide, please. So we wanted to take a minute as well to talk about general liability insurance coverage. Just basically from an insurance perspective, the district's insurance coverage is a contract. School districts have general liability insurance, and that's a contract between the school district and the insurance provider. And very simply put, that insurance contract provides two duties. The school district is paying the insurance company, and the insurance company is agreeing that they're going to assume the duty to defend and the duty to indemnify. The duty to defend is where the insurance company will pay the expenses of an attorney who goes into court and defends a lawsuit on behalf of the school district. The duty to indemnify is where the insurance company would actually write a check to a plaintiff or to someone who sustained an injury to compensate them for those injuries. In this situation, because for the reasons that we've talked about, the school district and officials may very likely be entitled to immunity, that even if they didn't receive immunity, that it would be very difficult to prove causation of a negligence claim. It's likely that very few, if any, payments for injuries would be made, but that duty to defend is still very important to the school district, because if they are sued, and it doesn't take much to file a lawsuit, but if they are sued, the district is going to want its insurance company, obviously, to pay the expenses of an attorney to go to court and try to get that matter dismissed. Obviously, the policy limits that are in your individual policies throughout your school districts apply, and policy exclusions apply as well. All insurance policies have various exclusions that indicate when the insurance coverage just simply does not apply. We have a lot of very specific laws in Kentucky related to time and notice requirements that apply for new policy exclusions. If any of you have perhaps been speaking with your colleagues across the border in Ohio, some of them may have recently received a policy exclusion for the upcoming school year related to communicable diseases or viruses such as COVID-19. However, it's our understanding in the preliminary research that we have done that that exclusion has not been sent out to any policyholders in Kentucky, and our laws provide that insurance companies have to provide you with 75 days notice prior to the renewal period before they put a new policy exclusion in place. At this point in time, your policy renewal period, I believe for most school districts, is July 1. So it appears at this point in time there will be no policy exclusion specifically related to COVID-19 that is going out to Kentucky school districts. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's no policy exclusion that would ever apply. You should certainly communicate with your board counsel and your insurance agent regarding any specific coverage that your school district has and any specific exclusions that are in your policy. I'll pause for a moment and see if Mr. Livingston has anything to add on that slide.
You're exactly right. I think what's important is for everyone to realize that there is not an exclusion that's been put on any of the policies for the three carriers that write school districts, or most of the school districts that are insured on a first dollar program. And you are correct also, there is a 75-day notice period that is in effect before the policy renewal. So those, if they were going to be sent out, would not have been sent out in time. And I'm not saying that they may not be looking at that for next year. There's a potential for that. But what they have talked about recently, and I know there was an email that everyone has seen, and it was not worded probably quite as well as it should have been. And there's there are no exclusions in the liability policies regarding recommendations. There are, if you have intent or if you have negligence where you are not following a law or a regulation, then there is a problem with that. But all of the information that's coming out from the Kentucky Department of Public Health, the governor's office, CDC, and your local health departments are recommendations, and there are no specific exclusions on those. And I think that one of the carriers actually sent out an email this morning to further explain that. But as Todd said, there at this point in time, there are no exclusions in the liability for recommendations or for COVID-19.
Thank you. So as David indicated, next slide will show, I think, this email that he discussed, and this is one that I think has been circulated among several superintendents. I think most of you have probably seen this already, but a question was posed about following guidance related to loading school buses and the number of students on school buses. And this response came back from one insurance company. It's only one insurance company that insures school districts. And as David said, I think there has been some conversation about that because it unfortunately referenced an intentional acts exclusion in the policy. We believe there may have been some confusion about the state guidance from the Department of Public Health and other state actors and whether or not that was regulation or statute. So several school districts as well as insurance agents have followed up, I think, with that company. And on the next slide, Tony, we understand, I have a bullet point there that's been updated. That was as of yesterday. We understood that Wright was reviewing the response for possible clarification. They have now issued a clarification on that matter and kind of stepped back from that view that the intentional acts exclusion would apply, understanding that what is coming down is guidance and not statutes or regulations. We also
Todd, excuse me, this is Wayne.
Sure.
I hate to interrupt you, but this is just so critical. I think people need to understand this. The intentional acts exclusion has always applied. That's not a new thing. So people shouldn't be, I guess my point is people shouldn't be frightened by that. You're never protected when you intentionally violate the law. It's just, clearly established law. If you know what it is and say, I don't care, I'm not going to do that, that's never covered and never has been. So I just want people to not overreact to that intentional acts exclusion. It's always been with us and always will be.
Thank you, Wayne. Absolutely. The intentional acts exclusion has existed in your policies for years. It exists in every pretty much insurance policy. So I appreciate your clarification there. KDE also understands that Liberty Mutual, which is a large insurer for school districts, has issued a response indicating they've reviewed the same type of scenario and indicated there's no per se exclusion. But of course, as with any insurance company, they won't commit to coverage in every scenario. Having done work for various insurance companies in my previous career, that's kind of their MO. They will not commit to every possible coverage scenario and whether or not coverage will be there. Again, there's this distinction in law versus guidance that I think may have resulted in the initial response by Wright that the intentional acts exclusion applied, but with some further explanation to them, it seems like they have changed their response on that. They've clarified it. In the Department of Public Health, I certainly won't put words in their mouth. I think Dr. Connie White may be on this call, but in previous webinars and webcasts that we've had with them, Dr. White has explained that unique circumstances may necessitate reasonable deviation from the guidance, or at least as I understand her explanation, that's the case. So I think they certainly recognize that there are unique circumstances that require school districts to deviate in a reasonable manner. Once again, we go back to that language of being reasonable and acting in good faith to deviate from that guidance. Next slide. Okay, so that's all I have in terms of prepared slides. I'll pause for just a moment in case either Wayne or David want to add anything in conclusion. And if not, we'll take any questions that may have come in. Tony?
I think we're going to defer the questions and just for about a few minutes. The Lieutenant Governor has joined us and she's on a tight schedule, Todd. So
Sure.
if you could just hold on, and I know there will be questions, and if I could introduce the Lieutenant Governor and Education Cabinet Secretary Jacqueline Coleman. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. I'll just tell you that I'm sitting in the lobby of my office because apparently a 4-month-old controls where I sit now because she's napping in my office. So forgive me for being out here in the open, but that's how it goes. I wanted to I talked with the commissioner and asked for just a couple minutes of your time. I wanted to come on because I know there is a lot of anxiety around the reopening of schools, in-person classes, I should say. And all of those concerns are heard loud and clear. We are here to support you all into creating the plans that you believe are best for your school districts and your students, your particular population. And each school district is going to face unique challenges. We know that. We get questions probably every day, either from concerned parents or concerned educators about what to expect. And the reality is, and you all know this, we don't know what to expect. And part of that is what's causing a lot of the challenges that we're facing. But if any profession responds to change and flexibility the way that we need to, it's public education. We are constantly thrown curveballs and asked to do the best we can with those situations. And basically that's what this is. And so I know a lot of you want to know all the answers and be able to tell all the answers. And the reality is none of us have that. But if we continue to work together and all of you all give us your input and share best practices and plans moving forward, we're all going to be better off for it. None of us are going to be in a perfect situation, but we're all going to be better off for it. And so I want to thank Commissioner Brown for utilizing the Education Continuation Task Force to be a voice for reopening and working with the Department of Health. We're going to add a few more folks to that as this conversation continues to evolve. And so I encourage you to continue to share with us your experiences, your concerns, and your solutions so that we can make sure that every school district is able to create the best plan possible. And with that, I will pause and Commissioner Brown, if there's anything I missed, I'll let you clean it up for me.
You got it. Thank you. I just want to reiterate for everyone, we're, as the Lieutenant Governor said, we're hearing you. We understand the frustration. We are all trying to balance the public health need and also the situation you face with logistics, but we're also knowing that we're looking ahead 2 to 3 months and we're trying to predict what's going to happen. We're also paying attention to what's going on in other states. All that is affecting how we are issuing guidance here. We want to make sure that that's up to date and is beneficial for you. So you'll see that the Education Continuation Task Force meets Monday. They meet every other week, as you all know, and I mentioned earlier. The Superintendents Advisory Council is now meeting every other week opposite of the Education Continuation Task Force. We're going to ask the Education Continuation Task Force to work on honing the guidance and work and continuing to provide feedback to the Department of Public Health. By the way, I can't say enough about how responsive they have been and understanding and trying to understand the situations that you all face. But we also want to make sure that we have the right members on the Education Continuation Task Force. And so I think we're going to be looking for maybe some members from the legislative branch. But also I have already asked and they've accepted the various agencies to have their presidents. So we're going to have the current president of KASS, the current president of KASA, and the current president of KSBA join your executive directors on the task force as well. That gives additional superintendent feedback on the task force. In addition to the following week, we'll have the superintendent advisory. So we want to make sure we're hearing you on that. So I know we're going to have conversations with public health. Other states are starting to release their public health guidance, and I think ours is being finalized, and we're working on that with public health because we're continuing to hear some of the issues you're raising. We want to make sure we get it right. So that's where we are.
If I could just say one more thing, I just want to make sure you all know that we really are being your voice as these policies are being churned out. I speak from an educator perspective, and so I say this kind of jokingly, but you all know I'm serious when we talk about wearing masks, students wearing masks. We've got to think of a whole new issue that involves dress code now, right? I mean, those are the realities of these things. When we talk about, obviously, the spacing, when we think about transportation, I just hope you understand that there are people that have real life experiences with these issues, and we are speaking up. Now, that doesn't mean that we have all the answers or that anything's gonna be perfect. But I do the best I can to, you hear that baby, sorry. I do the best I can to make sure that folks who've never taught in a classroom or run a school district think about this from your perspective. So we're doing the best we can to make sure that happens. And that's it. Thanks, Kevin.
Thank you. And also, we want to wish you a happy birthday. Little birdie told me it was your birthday. So
thank you. I appreciate all y'all getting together for my birthday today.
I think you have around 425 folks here for the party. So, and also want to reiterate to everyone that public health and everyone in the administration, we're trying to meet and to provide the best scenario to keep people safe, but also understanding logistical challenges. It's also going to take us in the school community meeting them halfway, and the current guidance from DPH is right in line with what every other state and is doing, and we're monitoring that. We want to learn. Other states are learning from what we're doing and borrowing some things that our DPH has done and borrowing some things from KDE and others, and we're doing the same. And so as I mentioned before, we're involved in the SREB guidance as well, and all that is similar. It doesn't mean it's easy, and that doesn't mean that there aren't logistical challenges for us to solve, or perhaps some compromises to reach. A great example is when DPH heard you about full buses and the need for that, being able to go back to the drawing board to find some solutions to that. And that's going to continue this summer. That kind of back and forth is going to continue. And as the Healthy at Work is example, that's why you hear Dr. Stack saying to go back and check that every day if you're an employer, because they continue to hear feedback. Things change, things with the virus changes. So just want to make sure you all know that we are hearing, the administration is hearing you, the department is hearing you, and we're going to continue on using our education continuation task force, enhance that membership, and then we've added in and already started that with superintendent advisory. So we're going to continue on throughout the summer using that process. So Todd, we'll turn it back over to you, and may want to go ahead and take some questions on this subject matter now, because some of your guests may need to get off of the webcast before we get to the final question and answer session.
Absolutely. We'll take questions to the extent we can that have come in. Of course, again, can't provide any legal advice, but happy to try to provide information on questions that may have come in.
Okay, so I'm just looking through all of these here. Give me a second. So there's a question about, where does discretionary immunity intersect with public health recommendations? What if we choose not to follow a recommendation? What is our level of liability?
I can't tell you what your level of liability is, but I will note that those decisions that qualify for qualified official immunity, again, have to be in good faith. That was one of the elements of qualified official immunity. So it has to be in good faith. Just simply stating that you're not going to follow any of the recommendations of the Department of Public Health, you're beginning to get into a situation where individuals may question whether or not you're acting in good faith. Reasonable deviations from the guidance for reasons that are unique circumstances, that could certainly be more in line with good faith.
Okay. The next question that I can see on here, let's see here, there's a lot of other stuff in here. I think you might be off the hook there, Todd. Let's see, they wanted to get a copy of the PowerPoint. Again, that should have been emailed to you. If you're not getting the emails, please let me know. Shoot me an email, tony.tatman@education.ky.gov. I think everything else on the soapbox is not related to this particular topic, so.
Okay.
Todd, may I? This is Dave.
Absolutely.
Okay. I just wanted to say real quick for everyone, each of your school districts, and again, talk to your board attorney, talk to your own agent. It doesn't hurt when you are making decisions to include your local health department, because they will be also working with the Department of Public Health. And it also shows a further manner of good faith when you're reaching out to different professionals in order to put your guidelines in, because each of your districts are unique. There's none like one like the other out there. So the more professionals that you can bring in that are help forming these guidance and recommendations, the more good faith you're showing when you are implementing these within each of your districts.
Okay. All right.
Thank you so much to David Livingston and to Wayne Young for joining us today, and I will turn it back over to Tony and Kevin.
Okay. Did you want to move on to Department of Health?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So next up, we have with the Department of Health, I believe it's 3:02, so they should both be online. Dr. Connie White and Emily, actually, Dr. White looks like she just joined us. Dr. White, can you hear us?
Yes.
Okay, looks like she just joined us. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. White and Emily Meserly with the Department of Public Health.
Hi, sorry I'm late. I was directionally challenged and trying to figure out how to get on the link, so I apologize for that. And Jan Bright is also joining us today as well. Our environmentalist, Becky Gillis, wasn't able to join us today. Thank you again for letting us come. I wanted to just give a really like a 2-minute overview for those of you who haven't been on any of the other calls. I think what we've learned, as we've talked before, is that there's not a one-size-fits-all. All schools are different. All of your needs are going to be different. And so we hope that we can give you some overviews of we don't have a lot of science-based evidence on COVID-19 itself. We don't have a lot of data-driven experimentation on COVID-19 itself, but we do know how to take care of a deadly viral disease. And so that's what we're going to be giving or sharing with you, the advice that we have on risk reduction, which is the same thing as mitigation. That's what we're all trying to do, is how do we work and how do we live and how do we learn in a COVID world. We know there are going to be cases in your school. There are going to be cases everywhere. So making sure that you plan the best mitigation that you can, and making sure that you plan how you're going to manage it when a case happens and how you're going to help with contact tracing. That's what's going to be so important. Schools have always led in communities. Y'all are the innovators. You're the creative people. You know how to take a problem and you know how to make it work. You knew how to take care of gender issues. You've been the leaders in race issues. This is just another issue that the community is going to be looking at you for all of your innovation and great ideas. And what we're trying to do, if you're old enough, we're going to go back to Fleetwood Mac. We're trying to break the chain. That's what we're trying to do here. Break that chain of infection. So respiratory hygiene, and that's covering coughs and masks, hand hygiene, social distancing, sanitation. Those are the 4 things. If you can get that concept in your head, and then you'll be able to look at your school setting and figure out how to make it work. So creating conditions that are going to make you successful when you reopen are going to be those 4 things, and making sure that you've got all of your kids up to date on immunizations, especially influenza, but all of the immunizations, because what we don't want is we don't want a measles outbreak in November, or a whooping cough, or any of the other things that could happen. So just that's kind of an overview of what we're here for. We're here is to partner with you, not to be a barrier, but to partner with ideas and questions, and be creative with this. So I'll stop talking now and turn it back over to you, and let us get started with questions that people might have that we can hopefully answer.
Thank you, Dr. White. And before we go into questions, we know your all's time is valuable too. You all are also not only providing guidance and recommendations to us, to the school community, but you're also advising all the other parts of our society. So we understand you're pulled in many directions. We want to thank you for what all you're doing. And just as a recap, we are going to be meeting internally at the end of this week, later on this week, with individuals from public health, the governor's office, lieutenant governor's office, KDE, to further hone the guidance. And then that guidance is going to then be layered in. It's going to stand on its own, but it'll also be layered into other guidance documents coming out from KDE over the next few weeks. So we're hearing your concerns, but also I want to remind you, as I said a few minutes ago, this takes districts also rising to the challenge. And I know there are many concerns out there, and there's a lot of anxiety. And that's not to say that there aren't some questions we still need to answer and some compromises that may need to be made. But we also, it's going to take all parties rising to the challenge on this and doing things we've never done. And I know I've seen some plans already from some superintendents that are really innovative and taking this in stride and doing the best that you can under these circumstances. And I appreciate the work that you're doing. I know a lot of the co-ops are also, in your associations, are involved in advising you as well. So, Tony, while we have them here, can we go ahead and take some questions related to the public health aspect?
Yes, we will go ahead and get some questions. Let's see. We will go with the first one is, do we have an idea on when the final state public health recommendations will be made available?
So this is Emily.
Go ahead, Emily.
This is Emily Messerly. I can answer that. Thank you, Commissioner Brown. So as these plans have developed, we are expanding our collaboration. That's why Lieutenant Governor Coleman came on the call today. So we are convening starting this Friday, and we will be getting the documents and the guidance out to you all as soon as possible. But I don't know that. I think on Friday, because that's a working group, we'll be setting a timeline for when it comes out. I do want to make one. I want to quote, I listened to a Senate hearing. There were 3 individuals who addressed the Senate recently about school reopenings, but specifically related to universities. And this can definitely be applied to our settings. So this is from the president of the American Public Health Association. And he said, any effort to move forward with reopening schools employing public health protections that are weaker than those in place in the surrounding community would be a critical mistake. So as we move forward, I wanted to say this because Commissioner Brown mentioned that we are also giving guidance to the community. We have to make sure that your school reopening plans align with the current plans in the community, that your plans are not weaker, so to speak, than the current community guidance as far as masks and social distancing and groups gathering. So I just wanted to bring that up as an important point.
Okay. Let's see here. We are looking at another question about, well, that's the same question, kind of just asked differently, sorry. If our health department, I guess they're talking their local health department, approves a traditional start for us, will that be allowed with appropriate social distancing? I guess they're just generally speaking in terms of if they work within their local health departments.
Mr. Brown, you want to take that one, or? Whatever the Department for Education, whatever the final document is, then the local health department should be a support for you to help as you're interpreting that and give any guidance that's gray or unclear to people.
That's right. I think that's right. And I think the traditional, I know we started out talking about the early start, traditional start, late start, to make sure you were thinking about those alternatives. Right now, I think we're all moving towards the ability to start in a traditional time frame, assuming that these protocols are followed and the virus trajectory does not change. That's just my observation. Public health folks, correct me if I'm wrong. Obviously, if you wait later for a later start until after August 24th, 26th into September, of course, that could have even a better situation with what the virus is doing. So I think we're all moving towards that progression of eyeing the traditional to late start of school year, as you all are already planning, assuming that we are going to implement the recommendations and the various precautions that will be coming out in that document.
Okay. The next question I have, I believe, is going to be probably maybe for both. Does a local board of education have to act upon starting athletics, or is it left up to the superintendent and local health department officials?
I think that's probably all of the above situation. Without knowing the specifics, I believe that's something you're gonna want to involve everyone. There could be a situation that it is under the superintendent's purview as long as public health, and you're working with KHSAA to make sure all the timelines are being satisfied. And KHSAA is also work with public health. But you need to check all those boxes, and then depending on what the issue is, whether or not it's a board decision or a superintendent decision, you need to check with your board counsel or a K group advisor.
Okay.
Todd, do you have anything else on that?
If they're specifically talking about the waiver of the dead period that recently occurred, that was waived to allow it, but does not require that sports occur during that time. I'll just put that caveat in there.
All right. The next question, or I guess observation, and this has been, this was asked in like by 12 different people. So the comment is these strategies are great, and I think this is going to reference back to Dr. Park's part of the PowerPoint. But what is the bottom line when it comes down to the social distancing? And what is going to be the expectation for schools when we get a confirmed case of COVID?
The expectation as far as contact tracing, I guess I'm not clear. If there is a positive case in the schools, then the local health department will come in and assist with the schools to determine who's at high risk that would need to be placed into quarantine and who's at low risk. So just because a child was in a school or a faculty member was in a school and had COVID-19, it depends on how long and how close together they were as to whether that person would be at high risk of contacting this very easily spread virus. So if you are at high risk, then you would be recommended to go home for a 14-day quarantine. If you just happen to be in the building with someone, we have lots of places have had cases where somebody on the second floor was in a cubicle and came in, sat down at their desk, talked to the two people on either side of their cubicle in close contact, but they didn't really have contact with anyone else. So those two people needed to go home for 2-week quarantine, as well as the patient who was infected. They need to be in isolation. But everyone else around them who just passed them in the hallway, they're a low-risk person. They would not have to be quarantined. So that's one of the things that Dr. Meserly and I have been talking about, is that as few of these kids that mingle with others that way you can keep the people that potentially would have to be quarantined to a minimum, so you have fewer children and fewer students, fewer staff leaving school, which is critical for, I know, the school to function properly.
This is Dr. Meserly. I wanted to tell the group that I will be sharing with Commissioner Brown a wonderful toolkit for all of your communities on contact tracing. There is a wonderful toolkit that our team here has developed that has talking points for a PSA. I think it would be very important this summer that your superintendents, your principals, using their social media. I'll send this and share with all of you. It's a wonderful toolkit explaining the whole contact tracing process and what we're doing across the state. And it provides that framework, that groundwork for why we will be instituting all these changes in school operations in the fall. So the more you can get out that education about the concept of contact tracing, I think it will maybe allay some of the fears of parents as they come back, and students as they come back to school in the fall with a different looking school. So I will send that contact tracing toolkit to this group. It's a wonderful way to share with your community.
And I have a question that came into me through text that I think, Tony, probably you have some similar ones, and I'm going to pose this to DPH. Before I do, the caveat is, although I think the question I'm going to ask you is will involve some issues that we're going to be discussing this week together. But I think a lot of superintendents are having a hard time understanding what will be if we go back to school, let's say, and let's just use a local high school as an example with 500 kids in it, and let's say we set our date at August the 20th, and that's our first day of school. What is going to be the trigger for me to say, okay, I can have all 500 kids in there today, the first day, or what's the trigger for me to say, oh, I can only have 250 kids and in there at one time, and what's the trigger for me on August 20th if I can't have any kids, and that is my decision on whether to defer till September or to have an NTI day. Do you understand what I'm saying? What are those triggers? How are they going to hear that? Is that going to come through a governor's press conference, or do we anticipate over the summer some kind of gating criteria that tells districts what period we are in, and then what part of social distancing does that trigger, and can your buildings be full or not?
Well, I think that's something that's going to come out of this final document that we have, and I would certainly see that kind of guidance coming from Commissioner Brown, with input from how much COVID infection rate do you have in your community. If you have a large number of COVID-19 cases, but they're all in one local nursing home, that's very different than if you have that same number of cases, but they're spread throughout the community. So the problem is there's not a cutoff. If you have 10 cases, you got to close school. Well, that's not really fair. It's not that clear. It has to be a layered approach to look at how many cases do you have. Where are those cases? What if you have 10 kids in Louisville Manual? That's very different than having 10 kids in Campbellsville High School, because that's a different number of population. So I don't know that there's an absolute definite, unless this group is able to, with education's help, guide us to give the best advice as to how you do that. I mean, I have to admit, you decide on flu. There's a metric that you have. You decide on when to close school because of snow. And that's very different in Lexington than it is in Bell County, where you've got very different roads to drive. So all of you will have your own way of figuring this out. And we're happy to help if there's questions. So Commissioner Brown, you can probably articulate this much better than I can. So do you think there'll be like a grid that will tell people that, or will it all be on an individual basis by school?
I'm thinking, and I think we're seeing some examples from some other states that we're going to be discussing later this week on some probably a hybrid decision making or guidance between public health and the department to help districts when we get to that time period. And what we're asking districts to do, and I know this is hard, but we're asking districts to have that playbook, as Marty referenced earlier, with being able to pivot. We hope you don't have to pivot to complete NTI next semester at all, but we know that you need to be ready to do that just in case there's a spike and we end up in a situation the governor has to call us all together and say, hey, I need you all to close because it's for the betterment of the state. On the other hand, we know that you all are already preparing for hybrid models because you're hearing that many of your parents, even if there were not a public health reason to reduce the number of individuals in your classrooms, you're hearing from parents that may not be comfortable sending their students, or maybe students are not comfortable coming in, at least right away until they see how this plays out. And so you're working already on hybrid plans on how to educate them when they're sitting at home, when some of their colleagues are sitting back in the classroom. And then we're working, and we're going to be working with the Lieutenant Governor's office and the governor to make sure you have direction and relief from and guidance on how you can count those students in attendance to make all those things happen. So it's going to be a very much a menu approach, and that's why we're asking you to plan for the best case for your opening, but knowing you may have to pivot at any time based upon those community factors. And then, of course, your partner there in all of this, your local health department officials are going to be working with you. They're advised, obviously, by the state officials. And so that's going to be a partnership that you're going to have to continue to utilize and want to utilize throughout at least the next school year.
All right, the next question that we have is the top question that's at the top of the soapbox is, can you provide an explanation of how student attendance is to be handled if some students are learning at school in person and others are learning remotely?
My goal, and I've directed KD staff to do this, and I know it's easier said than done, is that a student learning remotely can be counted the same as a student, so long as certain that you are actually educating that child, can be counted same or similar to a child sitting in a desk in your school building for temporarily for the next semester until the General Assembly can come in and give us more relief through permanent measures. We would do that through asking the governor to exert his emergency order authority by asking the cabinet secretary to endorse the proposal that we will give her. That's the plan. That's easier said than done, but the team is working on it. And we think that we will have some solutions really soon. The goal is to have those in about 6 days. Robin, have I scared you yet? Robin Kinney?
You always scare me. If I could jump in, though, and share with the superintendents, at yesterday's Superintendent Advisory Council, we had a really good discussion, I think, with the members on that advisory committee, just talking about some of the challenges of attendance and funding, and how we do this in this new world where traditionally how we take attendance and how we account for funding, at least from an ADA perspective, is either in person in a seat in a school building, and either half day or full day. And so obviously that traditional model doesn't really fit with what we anticipate is going to be coming at us in the fall. So we started that discussion with superintendents yesterday. Again, heard their thoughts and some of the things that they see as challenges. We also shared with them what the department has been working on and sort of some of our goals that we're trying to keep in mind. And with Commissioner Brown's approval, we are going to come to you at the next superintendent webcast on next Tuesday, and share that with the broader audience of what we are hearing and kind of the direction that we would like to recommend that we move forward with. But I guess the primary goal overall, and Commissioner Brown has said this as well, is we really want to be cognizant that the system and the ties to funding shouldn't influence you making a good or bad decision on behalf of your students. The students need to come first. So we are trying to create a way to do this so that there's no incentive or disincentive for you to choose either in-person attendance or remote learning, because we know you'll need both, and we know that you'll need that in varying degrees potentially throughout the school year. So you may start one way and you may have to quickly change. You may have more in person, you may go to less in person. So we'll need that level of flexibility when we could talk about taking attendance and then associating that with funding. So that is something that we will be bringing forward to you to share the conversations that are already developing, and to seek your additional input on Tuesday.
All right, the next question that I have is, these are going to be kind of surrounding NTI. There's a question about when we have an elementary age student whose family will not send them into in-person classes, will we need to have them do NTI full-time, or will we need to enroll them in a virtual school?
This is, Robin may want to comment. We heard this proposal, or the idea of, instead of keeping Johnny and Sally, whose parents don't want to send them to Mrs. Brown's second grade, instead of keeping them enrolled in the Jones Elementary School in Mrs. Brown's second grade, you would then enroll Johnny and Sally over in the virtual school that you're going to create, even if it's obviously on paper and it lives virtually. We heard this from at least one superintendent as an idea. I don't know, Robin, if you want to comment whether that makes a difference or not on what we are thinking about potential funding solutions, whether that the child is actually then on paper transferred over to another virtual environment instead of sitting in Mrs. Brown's classroom.
So I think our goal would be that students should receive that instruction however it's best for the student in coordination with the efforts of their local school district. Our goal, as far as attendance and funding, is to make that invisible. So you don't have to worry, well, if I have Johnny in a remote learning environment at his home, we count it the same as if Johnny was also in your classroom in front of a teacher in person. So from a funding perspective, we want to make that invisible.
All right, the next question is going to revolve around some guidance around marching band. They were asking again, just wanting to see what they need to do because it involves a lot of students and support to make their marching band season successful. Dr. Foster, are you on?
Sure, yes. I will share what I shared last week. This came from the governor's office, and they have said that you need to follow the guidance around the June 15 activities. And the statement was districts can open campuses on June 15th for activities with students. Groups are 10 or fewer, as long as public health protocols that are being followed, the ones that were outlined for youth sports guidance in the youth sports guidance document. And then Dr. Stack provided additional information saying certain activities with higher aerosol risk, like wind instruments at band practice, must be outdoors and with increased social distancing of 10 feet.
And then, Kelly, I'll add to that, this is going to be a team approach here, and Dr. White may then follow me up. I also just received an update from Commissioner Tackett, who has in turn talked to Dr. Strobe with the Kentucky Music Educators Association. That association is finalizing guidance to be submitted to Department of Public Health as far as taking the marching band on through the late summer and fall as to how they envision that might happen.
And I will say that when Dr. Stack says wind instruments, he just means things that you blow in. So like a trumpet's not a wind instrument, but you get the picture of what he's talking about, something you blow in. I called it a blowing instrument, but it didn't make the cut on the edits.
And so, Dr. White, this is Kelly. Do you think that there's a way that in the public health document, something could be in there specifically about band?
Yeah, I mean, I don't see us coming up with a public health document. I see this as a public health and a KDE document. So I think if Commissioner Brown's okay with that, I think that there's some place that we can add that in, because I think that's an important distinction to make.
Okay. Dr. Park said he wanted to make another point about the alternative learning strategies. Dr. Park, are you there? I think you're on mute. Dr. Park?
Yes, can you hear me?
I can. Go ahead.
Yes, I just wanted to make one final point in reference to a few of the Go Soapbox questions, and just to point out that the release of the alternative learning design strategies now, while there are obviously, as Commissioner Brown and Dr. Foster and others have mentioned, while there are additional logistics to work through and guidance to work through, that now is a really a perfect time, if we can, to think about professional learning as tagged towards these design strategies for their reopening in the fall. And so, for example, the Murray Summit today, there are hundreds and hundreds of teachers and leaders engaged in professional learning. That many sessions, I know one specifically had over 500 folks all online together working through some of these digital learning strategies that we would tag into the strategies that are released in the guidance. So thank you so much. That's just one point I wanted to mention in terms of a timeline and having time to kind of think through and engage in what next step for professional learning is best for teachers.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Park. I just wanted to ask another question. This is kind of going back to food service. I know that Robin had just mentioned this, but they're wanting to know just about, do we know if there's going to be allowances made for food service and transportation with a possible late start?
I don't really, I'd probably need a little more information on allowances for the late start. I don't know what that's referring to when it talks about food service and transportation.
Okay.
So maybe if we could get a little more detail around that question, the requester could send that directly to me, and I'll talk with staff in my office.
Okay. Another question kind of relating to the innovation and the meeting of DPH requirements is just wondering how they're supposed to pay for all of this. I don't know, I'm not sure if that's a funding question or if there's ideas on how we can help them with how to fund some of these ideas.
I'll take the first stab at that. Whenever anyone says, how are we going to pay for this? I do take it as a funding question. And Dr. White is going, that's not me. I do, it is a challenge. I mean, when we're talking about masks and gloves and thermometers and all the things that come along with it, all of that does cost money. I mean, that's realistic. Now, we do have some funding that is coming in the way of CARES Act funding, so that is available. And then the other thing, I'll just give a little bit of preview. I have very graciously, the emergency management team has offered to have someone come onto our next call on Tuesday as well to talk about possible, and I stress on the word possible because I haven't heard their presentation even myself, possible reimbursement for some of these expenses that we're talking about. So they are going to have a representative come on next week, again on the Tuesday call. It's going to be a fun Tuesday call with, we're going to talk about attendance and funding, and we're going to talk about FEMA. And I know that's at least two things that we're going to talk about next week. But I would encourage you to tune in because I've asked them to come and talk about eligible expenditures, documentation, and just a kind of an overview of FEMA and how school districts may be able to seek reimbursement under FEMA. So please make sure you join next week for that conversation.
Tony and our DPH folks and KDE folks, I received a comment just now from a superintendent about the recommendations that have been discussed on previous calls from public health about kids, the idea to reduce contact, having teachers change rooms instead of students. And if we had any guidance on how that would work in secondary schools, and that may be something, if we don't have that, that's something that we may want to check with our SREB folks or CCSSO KDE staff to see if other states have figured that out yet. Kelly, if anybody want to comment on that?
I believe Dr. White's trying to comment, but is on mute.
I muted myself. Sorry. That just would be ideal. That would be the less way for kids to mingle. I know it can't happen everywhere in every school.
Thank you. Also received a comment from a superintendent about if we have any recommendations of school systems that have good reopening plans. I know there are some out there, and I know that KASS, Jim Flynn, has created a repository for plans so you all can share those. We are not requiring reopening plans to be submitted to the department. Just be glad Kentucky is no longer a part of Virginia, because I believe Virginia is requiring you to submit your reopening plans. So we are not requiring you to submit reopening plans, and don't expect you to do so. What we expect is that you have reopening plans and you have that playbook, being able to pivot if the situation changes. However, we know it's beneficial for you to see what your neighbor is doing. We know you automatically have that conversation and camaraderie with your colleagues at co-op meetings, but KASS is also going to be a repository for that to share.
Okay. Just a couple of questions, and I think this is going to be a future topic. In fact, I know it is going to be a future topic on a webcast. I'm just not sure if it's going to be next week or the week after on safe crisis work and safety. So questions about whether they need to leave their doors open and closed. Kevin, have you talked at all with?
Yes, John Akers is aware of that issue. Kelly, do you want to comment? We know there will be issues like that and other issues that are coming where we may have a public health requirement or recommendation that butts up against maybe a safe school issue. And we need to see how we're going to figure that out to solve both the school safety issue, but also the public health issue, which is also a safety issue. So that's one example of something that John's going to help us figure out in the Kentucky Center for School Safety. Kelly, do you have a specific answer to that one?
I will just say that we have collaborated with the Center for School Safety, and John and his team has provided us information, and that is a piece of guidance that will be coming out around school safety issues during COVID, as well as your drills, your safety drills that you typically have to do, social distancing in the building, drop off and pick up due to the possibility of more people dropping their kids off and picking them up in the afternoon. So that is on the schedule to be released.
And then, as you know, with that schedule, we always have that as part of our webcast the following day. So I don't have that calendar in front of me, but I do believe that's coming up here within the next couple of weeks. So that, going on to the next question, how do you foresee classified staff being paid if we use a late start?
I think this question is a KDE question, and I think the question likely references the late start under statute that we sometimes refer to as the boat dock bill. That provision provides for starting late, which is, I believe, I don't have the law in front of me, I'd have to pull it up, but the Monday closest to Labor Day. Then school districts are able to satisfy their requirements in 1,062 hours, regardless of the number of days, and have those days treated equivalent to 170 for the purpose of submitting that and receiving credit from the department. There's also language in the statute related to having that be the equivalent of 170 days for contract purposes as well. And we've received some questions on this and gone back and looked at the statute. To read it any other way than to give employees credit for that 170 days toward fulfilling their contract would render that provision of the law really meaningless. That is, that there would be no reason to include it in the law if it weren't meant to give the employees credit for 170 days in their contracts. The next issue becomes certified versus classified. Obviously, certified staff are on a salary, so they'll receive credit for 170 days and be paid accordingly. But when we look at classified staff who are paid hourly, it appears that the staff would receive credit as if working for 170 days, regardless of the number of days that it was. However, they're only paid for the number of hours that they actually worked. Those number of hours will increase each day because the school is going longer days to fulfill its 1,062 hours in less than 170 days. So the staff will receive their additional compensation for those additional days over the course of the school year that they're actually reporting to work. So they're not going to be paid, let's say, for example, if the school district satisfies its 1,062 hours in 165 days, those 5 days difference between that and 170, they're not going to be paid any additional money, but they would have satisfied their 170 days of the total number of days required in their contract.
Okay. All right, the next question is just a question on what social distancing is going to look like when you have a student who needs a one-on-one aid.
And I would say, Tony, that question also is related to this. Probably the answer applies to the same question I saw pop up about safe crisis management during COVID, because that's a one-on-one assist.
This is Emily Messerly. We will certainly make sure to address that in our document. Jan Bright is our Child Health Division Director, and she has specific experience with special needs children. So we will make sure that that guidance is clear about the personal protective equipment when you are in close contact with a student.
Okay. Let's see here. There's a question for public health. I'm not really, okay, it says, what does public health advise for students who are runners or who need touch? Should everyone wear gloves or just carry them? I'm not sure. I think we need clarification on that question. I'm not sure if that means like running as a sport. So if someone can clarify, I'm not sure if that means, I'm not really sure what that means. So if we can clarify that question, my apologies on that.
It may be, maybe they're like a runner, as in like a gopher, like going to get things throughout the school for the teacher.
Possibly.
No, I think they are a runner as part of possibly their disability or their condition. They like to run from large crowds, or they like to run when they get overly stimulated. So I think they're asking, do you recommend that the school staff wear gloves when trying to retain that student?
Well, certainly student safety is the most important issue. So if there's good hand hygiene throughout the day, after having contact with someone, again, trying not to make things incredibly onerous, but just to promote safety. So no, you don't want to put your gloves on while a child runs in a dangerous area.
And as a general rule, in the school setting where you are not providing food service, where you are not providing a specialized school health procedure like the school nurses do, we do not recommend wearing gloves in the general classroom. The frequent hand hygiene is a much better public health strategy.
Okay. All right, the next question that we have is, well, it looks like Robin may have had to jump off. I know she had to get on a CCSSO call, so I'll have to put off some questions on food service because I'm not sure if there's anybody on to answer that call.
Tony, I have a related question to the previous one on hand hygiene.
Okay.
Because public restrooms are considered high-risk areas, will there be specific guidance from public health concentrating on how to handle bathrooms in schools?
Yeah, I think that the gloves are important when you've got someone, a staff member who's cleaning an area and they're using products that could be harmful to them. And you know, just unless I'm cleaning my own bathroom, I'd be wearing gloves anyway. So I think the gloves are important to protect the staff, because once you put on a pair of gloves and you start using them, then you're touching everything. You're just collecting things on your glove. You're much better off using the hand hygiene, the hand sanitizer frequently throughout the day, so that it would be the equivalent of putting on new gloves all the time, which would be a waste of PPE, expensive, and just a pain. So if you can get people to do that frequent hand sanitizing, that's a more effective public health measure and just more realistic in the real world.
And Commissioner, the other thing to keep in mind about bathrooms and other high-touch areas, there is information you already utilize in your school for sanitation and cleaning. And during this event, that's something that will need to be done on a more frequent basis. And that needs to be somewhat determined around schedules and how often and how quickly things are being utilized or touched.
And then there's a follow-up question from this superintendent, and I think that answers part of the question. The other part is the controlling students, the flow of students, knowing that bathrooms are sensitive areas. In the bathrooms, there may be occasion where, you know, social distancing cannot be monitored. So if there's any recommendation on how to deal with that, and that is both the KDE as well as public health as well in our future guidance.
We will make sure to address that, because absolutely bathrooms are more of a confined space, similar to the school bus. We'll make sure to address that as far as, you know, staggered visits to the restroom, you know, only a certain number of children at a time. And of course, in the restroom, they would need to have their face covering on if they're of appropriate age.
Okay. This question is for Dr. White. We would typically hold in-person teacher trainings and meetings in group settings in late July and early August. Do the CDC guidelines for students return to school apply in the same way for adults?
Yes, I would say so. I haven't attended an in-person meeting of more than 3 people since March. I think you start finding creative ways to use Zoom. I want a crown that says the Queen of Zoom on it, because that's what I do all day, all the time. So I think that, again, mitigation. Why would you bring a group full of people into a room with the potential of an asymptomatic person making your entire teaching staff sick versus doing a Zoom meeting and getting the information out? And that way nobody has been placed at any risk. So that would be my recommendation, and I think it would be the CDC's. Is that feasible, Commissioner Brown?
I think so, yes. Thank you.
We're wondering what the recommendation might be for teachers who teach PE or physical education.
As far as how they should do that, or?
Yes.
Well, you know, social distancing, space kids out, make sure especially if you're shouting. We know 6 feet is what we're looking at for talking, but if you're singing or you're shouting, then I would give that more distance, just as we talked about the instruments where you blow into. You're going to project more aerosol. So you want to, as a teacher, to stay further away, and then use this as an opportunity to use that whole gymnasium when you're having those kids do whatever activities that they're doing. If they're 6 feet apart, do you want them running sprints in a mask? That probably isn't very feasible. But if they're standing in line to go to the water fountain, you keep them as far apart as you can, but then that might be a time for a mask. I mean, think of how the virus spreads and figure out how you can decrease that risk as much as possible for that child and for that teacher.
Next question just pertains to when schools or districts might be able to resume ESS and after school activities.
I think we look at, as was earlier said, right now gatherings of 10 or more people are not recommended. At the end of this month, that's going to go up to 50, and we're working right now on that documentation. Talked with Dr. Stack about that this morning. So I think you're going to try to, if you need to hold after school activities, and I spent my whole life doing after school activities, and that's important. But again, you're going to have to do it with social distancing, with facial coverings, with hand sanitizer, and spacing those kids out, because if it's after school, you try to use a bigger area where you can space kids out. So not trying to deprive them of their livelihood, but putting them doing that in a safe way so someone doesn't get infected because they stayed for Key Club or Honor Society or whatever activity you might be having, FFA, whatever. I don't know if that answers the question.
Well, and a key point for after school activities would also be, even though it's not traditional school instruction, taking attendance of who is at that after school activity for the purposes of contact tracing. Just like if I operate a small convenience store on the corner, I may start asking my customers to write their name and phone number down so I know who's been in my business. Just keeping track of who's together in groups after school as well as in school is going to be important.
And we keep talking about this, the students and the staff. Dr. Mesler and I were talking this morning. We've only had 2 cases of the MIS-C, which is the infection that children get that's very dangerous. So we aren't talking about a high number of children getting sick. I'm concerned about those parents and grandparents that they're going home to. I'm concerned about other staff members that might be elderly like me in that over 60-year-old age group or comorbidities, and the staff's family members. So we're really not just looking at children and staff. We're looking at children, staff, and everybody that they touch. And we haven't brought that up this time, but I wanted to throw that out there because the reach is much bigger than what you see in your school that day.
Okay. There's a question about just a concern about the addition of bus monitors and the expense that that's going to cause, and talking about limited funds available in the CARES Act. So I'm not sure if that's going to be in Healthy at Schools requirements or guidance, but just wondering a little bit more about what's going to be required in terms of buses.
We will make sure that when we collaborate as a group that we include transportation with the Lieutenant Governor's Advisory Council, and make sure that just like any policy or mandate or recommendation, we don't want to make something required unless we know that we hopefully have funding to back it up. So we will make sure to address that.
Okay, sounds good. I will go ahead and ask another question. Todd, if there's a question with the boat dock bill, considering extended day contracted folks, if we can get to 1062 in 160 days, saving mandatory 10, would extended day folks work 10 fewer days to complete the contract? I hope that makes sense.
I believe it does. And if that individual wants to communicate with me, we can dig into all of the facts on that. But generally, I believe the answer to that question is yes. If they were under contract, let's say they were a 240 contract day individual and the district satisfied its obligations for instruction in 160 days, that individual would work 10 less days. So 230 days instead of 240.
Okay, sounds good. Next question. I think there was another one on here regards to boat dock, but it seems like it had moved up. So if I see that here in just a second, I will go ahead and add that up. We have about 5 minutes left on the webcast. And again, in relation to the guidance that's going to come out with Healthy at Schools, another question is will we be required to hire the monitors for buses to check for the temperature checks and the masks that are being needed? So maybe just keep that in mind with the guidance documents, DPH, if you don't mind. I think that's already in the forefront in the background, but just wanted to make sure that was brought up as well as part of that. Let's see.
Department of Public Health are very familiar with unfunded mandates. So yes, we have a lot of respect for that, and it'll be considered.
Okay. Todd, I think this might be another question. If the extra hours cause a work week to go over 40 hours, overtime would be required to be paid, correct?
Yes, that's correct. What we call the boat dock bill wouldn't have any impact on wage and hour law. So if an employee was non-exempt and otherwise qualified to be paid for overtime, then that would be the case if they worked in excess of 40 hours. Districts should communicate with their board counsel to be sure that they're complying with all Department of Labor wage and hour laws.
Okay. All right, and I think that the food service questions that we have left over, and I know there's a couple in there. I know that Robin said that she will work on getting those worked on for next week, so we're not passing those over. I just want you to know that we will get those worked out for you. And then I think Dr. Thompson, Matt Thompson, had said he would like to share some survey results with us at the department. I have encouraged him to send me those results here, and I'll be more than happy to look at those and share those with others as well. So I appreciate that feedback. Just some survey results that he had sent out with to his families in the district. And with that, Interim Commissioner Brown had to step off the call to deal with just an emergency situation. So I'm going to have to close out the webcast. I appreciate DPH. And everybody who was able to participate today. As always, we will be back next week between the hours of 2 and 4 Eastern Standard Time. If anybody has any other questions or feedback that they would like to provide, you can always ask the questions in that Google form. We just update the date every week, but that Google form is always live. So you can always answer and submit questions to us in that Google form. And with that, I think we will exit the webcast for this week. Thank you all very much.